Most of you, the organizations with which you're associated, have strategies, one way or another. You know, you're supposed to have that. How many of you feel that the strategies that your organization are using actually work? They're actually achieving the objectives? Not that many. I see a few hands go up. But there's a growing sense that what we teach you in a business school in strategy simply isn't working. The data is a little bit dodgy, as the Brits would say, but by some estimates, 2/3 to 3/4 of strategies don't work. Jens, supposing you're a physician, and for every 10 patients that Dr. Jens sees, they come in, he does his diagnosis, comes up with some prescription, whatever, and within 6 months, 7 are dead. Karen, you're an architect. Karen does these beautiful tall buildings. Well, beautiful, that leaves out London. But these tall buildings. And for every 10 buildings she designs, within 6 months, 7 collapse. Coniston, you're a barrister, as they would say. She represents tough cases. For every 10 clients that Coniston represents in court, 7 are given the death penalty. If this was the record of achievement, you would start saying there's something wrong with what we're doing. And we're finding more and more that strategy, as we tend to teach it in an academic setting, simply isn't working. And I think there's clearly a need for a new, fresh perspective. The strategies, and I'll come to this momentarily, I'll do a quick refresher on what we tend to teach typically. The strategies, the Porter, et cetera, models were very appropriate to the 1980s and 90s. They're not appropriate today. And the question becomes then, what can we do to replace it? Who I'll talk about, some of you might have had him, it's purely coincidental, although I think it's good that he is at Berkeley, David Teese, who's a Kiwi actually, has been at Berkeley since 1985, 83, something like that. And David is the most cited academic in management and strategy in the last 15, 20 years. And in 1997, he, with a couple of his doctoral students, but he does the heavy lifting in this, wrote a paper on this concept called dynamic capabilities. That paper remains the single most cited academic paper on strategy and management in the last 20 years. And the basic question to get to the end point, is this going to be the next best big thing, the new model of strategy? It remains to be seen. But it's very seductive. It's got a lot going for it. So I want to go over that with you briefly. I'm not going to read all these to you. Strategy, strategos, a Greek word. The etymology of that word, 2 components, the army and leading, tying into a lot of the leading. That's why so much of the terminology in the field of strategy has these military overtones. What's our mission statement, et cetera. There is no single definition of strategy out there. It's really kind of an elusive term. But clearly, leading is there. If we look at it, though, why do so many organizations not only not achieve their strategy, so many organizations perish? Are organizations simply born to die, that they don't go on forever? You know, it's interesting when you look at this, Jens, so many of the organizations that have been identified that live a long time, they're German, because they're not public. And we've been talking, something like 80% of the 1,000 largest firms in Germany are family owned. So a lot of the pressures, if you're publicly traded, we all know, grow or die. And that brings about lots of negative behaviors that firms have to engage in. But most organizations die. They don't make it. Why is that? The human analogy isn't perfect in this, but can an organization live on forever? Is it a function of bad managers, dumb managers, external market conditions, inability to really acknowledge what's going on? The list of why firms, and great firms as well, fail is endless. This certainly is not all-inclusive, but it starts to capture, I think, some of the basic factors. Insufficient comprehension of market signals. And some firms, in your face, and they still don't get it. Things are going on, they don't see it. Inability to change, that's something I'll come back to. What do human beings dislike more than anything? The change. Where's Bart sitting? Is Bart here? Yeah, Bart, we'll come back to that because a lot of neuroscience There is a reason why people find it difficult to change. Management trapped in old business models. Cisco still is a firm that makes money selling routers and switches. And that industry is changing. It hasn't been able to get out of that because it's been an 80% pre-tax margin. They've got 80% market share. There's no future in that. They own it. What's the next thing? But they make so much money in that. I think I was mentioning, I used to do work, we used to do at Haas, some programs with Cisco. And their business development guy would come in often. And they've got a lot of money. It's about a $40 billion firm. They were sitting on $25 billion. But he said, we could buy things, but if we buy something, it's got to be an 80% margin business. How many firms are, because what's going to happen? The PE is going to get crushed otherwise. He said, we're not going to do that and punish our shareholders. They're trapped in the fact of their prior success. Where else do you find it? And they needed, at that time, Chambers was talking about the growth targets required 5 to 6 billion US annual revenue increase. You don't find businesses 80% margin like that. They can't get out of it and they're still suffering. That's one problem. So many of these short-term, risk-averse, corporate arrogance, hubris, FD&H syndrome, the Americans will know that classic fat, dumb, and happy. And a lot of organizations get that way. Hey, life is good, not to worry, and they end up paying a price. Did you see that? Not that you want to. But part of this, it comes out a static bias. And this is a problem academically with strategy. It tends to be static bias. How we win today, though, we are privileged, unlucky, you take your choice, to live in today's world. Because we are in one of the great periods of change in certainly modern economic and business history, truly transitional times. How do you know where markets are going? What do you use to guide yourself, to position the organization to succeed tomorrow? So many changes out there. To stay on our British theme here, a quote from Darwin that's getting a lot more play these days. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. Rather, it is the one that is most adaptable to change. And we're seeing that term show up more and more. How does a firm rapidly adapt in an environment that is unpredictable? Strategy itself, and this is a little primer part, I'm going to go fast. There are three basic components to it. Now, there's an external environment. The market, what's going on, you have to know that, blah, blah, blah. The organization formulates the strategy. Two other parts, structure and process. Interestingly, in the 1980s, the dean, some of you might have been there at the time, Ray Miles, and one of his doctoral students at the time, Chuck Snow, had been at Penn State, pardon the expression, for a number of years. But they wrote a book on that, strategy, structure, and process. And Ray was one of those who really, Ray Miles, got these concepts out there. Once the strategy is there, and again, that has to be in concert with what's going on in the market, the firm has to organize the resources it has, the assets it has. And that's always an issue. Perhaps the first truly serious book in strategy was written in 1962, published by MIT Press, titled Strategy and Structure by Alfred D. Chandler, Jr. Of all things, Chandler was a business historian. He was not a social scientist. He didn't do 1,000 surveys of thousands of units. In that book, he looked at 4 large firms, and he essentially wrote 4 long case studies, one on General Motors, one on DuPont, the chemicals firm, one on Sears Roebuck, which used to be the major merchandiser in the world, certainly in America, and the last on what used to be called Standard Oil of New Jersey, now Exxon. He found all 4 of those firms at a certain point of their development underwent a major reconfiguration of resources, restructuring, reorganization. Got it all laid out, divisions collapsed together, others broken up. Then management, and these were all 4 acting independently, stood back and said, great structure, what should our strategy be now? And all 4 nearly failed. And what came out of that was the title of his book, Strategy and Structure. Strategy is the independent variable, structure is a dependent variable. Structure counts then. And then finally, up close and personal, process. What are the appropriate incentives to put in place to motivate those people in that structure to pursue behaviors that might best result in the achievement of the strategy? What control mechanisms are necessary, what communication means, and that term that Rich certainly has been pushing a lot at Berkeley, that nebulous thing, the culture, the values of the organization. All of these three count, and they have to be in alignment. But to foreshadow where I'm going, strategy began to insinuate itself into the curriculum of good business schools as a real field. And in doing that, it began to create a big wall between strategy and structure and process. It focused on formulation. And that other stuff, that's that touchy-feely stuff. Some other class might deal with that, OB, or we don't do that. We're strategists, we're macho. And strategy began to get better in terms of tools. But one reason, I think, a major reason why we see these failures, what's the point of formulating a strategy that can't be executed? We ended up creating brilliant strategies that simply were so Germanic. These angels dancing on the head of the pin, or maybe the French. The perfect strategy. And France has written the perfect constitution 38 times in the last 50 years or something. These are so perfect they can't be executed. Now, the typical roadmap, if you will, of a strategy. And these things vary a bit, but most of you who have strategies, the probability is very high that you go through these types of steps. First of all, mission, vision, and mission. One way to think about this, I use it when I teach in terms of time. Tomorrow, where are you going? Vision, mission, goals, and objectives. You want to set those. That's tomorrow. Okay, where are we today? Situation analysis, or a guy who was at Stanford Research Institute in the 1960s, Cecil Humphrey, wrote the first paper, the first known use of the term SWOT. And that's typical. We look, okay, externally, what's going on out there, the OT, opportunities and threats. Then we turn the telescope around. We look internally, the SW, strengths and weaknesses. And strategy is a function of getting those in alignment. Current market conditions, current capabilities, et cetera. We then formulate the strategy, and we define, or it comes out of that, our quote-unquote competitive advantage. And that's where strategy is done. Then the strategy, the ultimate strategic tool is money. Ultimately, strategy is a resource allocation decision at the end of the day. No organization has unlimited resources. This is something you think about on a daily basis. Where you put your money, where we define, those are strategic. And then what got kind of relegated, left to the end? Strategy, execution, structure, and process. But the really heavy lifting, presumably, went into all this. Strategy formulation. That's what people focused on. Strategists focused, and that's what we focused on as educators to train people like you when you were undergoing your training. Again, typical elements then, we'd look at the alignment, come up with a strategy. Personal values did count. We look at those. Some of the soft stuff factored in, but not much. And then clearly understanding broader societal expectations, CSR stuff, and you all use that term over here, right? Because as I've come to learn, CSR in many parts of the world, cheat, steal, and rob. It maybe is more appropriate, but it is corporate social responsibility, something that Berkeley does a good job of focusing on. Critical success factors, all right, and again, we're on the traditional strategy. What does the market demand? Peter Drucker, who was a very brilliant strategist, educator, writer, commentator, often what are called the Drucker Questions. He wrote a book in the 1960s about management, and he said 2 questions that have to be answered in this part. What business are you really in? Who is the customer? And they seem so simplistic, but they're the heart of much of strategy. What are you really pushing out there? What does the customer really want? And who is the DMU, decision-making unit? And then we would look at key factors for success based on that analysis. How do you win? Maybe the market, it's essentially perceives your goods as a commodity, so it's a race to the bottom. Who can cut costs the most? Perhaps you've positioned it as a quality product. How do you enhance the perception of the brand of quality, et cetera? We do that. And then we look externally, and typically that went through a process using acronyms, PEST or STEP. The 4 major buckets, P-E-S-T, political factors, E, economic, S, social, cultural, and finally, T, technology. Those 4. And of the four, we began to realize, and you don't have to be a Marxist to realize this, technology is the most important. And of course, I bring up Marx because in any Berkeley lecture, you must invoke Marx at least once. But aside from that, while we're at it, by the way, apropos to nothing, the best quote from Marx ever, and it really fits into so much of what we've talked about. He wrote it in the 1844 manuscripts. The enemy of being is having. And you think about that, it's so real. The enemy of being is that. Because once you start getting stuff, your life is over. You need that stuff, and you lose your beingness. But at Berkeley, it does fit in. So we would look at this. We would do the external analysis, environmental analysis, as it's called. And very much part of this, what became the heart of a lot of strategy, the search for competitive advantage. That term has gone through morphed through distinctive competence, competitive advantage, et cetera. Jay Barney, who sounds like reverse Darwinism, he went from UCLA to Ohio State to SMU, but he's had some interesting articles on this. And he coined a term, VRIO, VRIO. And he says, if you think about what is your source of advantage, and time out on this again, the empirical data, firms that have succeeded over time have not done it randomly. There's been a reason why they're successful. And much of strategy, what is that reason? What is that ultimate factor that makes your offering something demanded compared to others? He said a real competitive advantage. V is valuable, R is rare, I is inimitable, and O, you have the organizational capabilities to actually make it work. That is very much part of what strategy is about, finding what's the advantage. An example I often use when I talk about this to the class is Berkeley. Berkeley is not the largest school, but Berkeley has one of the lowest rates of admission. Given the number of applicants, we take very few people. Part of it is a small school. Part of it certainly being public school tuition. But there's another factor that very much, I think, is instrumental in Berkeley's success. Who's in real estate? What's the reason for success? Location, location, location. It very much helps. Many of you, we were talking, Jens, you said, like many, Jens from Germany comes to Berkeley, seduced there. God, do I really want to go back? Maybe stay here. Cab driving isn't that bad of a calling when you think about it. But Berkeley does that. Berkeley is part of it. It's very much part of our attraction is the location. Well, in that context and strategy, we do that analysis. We think about our competitive advantage. And the person who really made modern strategy, my job, I owe to that interview teacher, Michael Porter, who wrote in his 1980 book, Competitive Strategy, he just swept the field in that. As I was telling Rich, I did an MBA at Harvard. When I took the so-called strategy course, it was called PBE, Planning in the Business Environment. And it was just a collection of cases. And Porter, an economist, an IO, industrial organization theorist, when he started teaching there after the first year, he said, what is this? This is just gratuitous data. You read a bunch of cases and presumably you're a strategist. He said, not good enough. And he introduced this model based on his own training as a industrial organization theorist. And that model is essentially a positioning model. His strategy is how you position yourself in the market is how you win. And probably the single most well-known graphic in management in the last 50 years is Porter's famed 5-force model. First introduced in a little, quote, note, as it was called, that he gave students in 1976. He started teaching at Harvard in 75. Wrote an article in HBR in 79, and then wrote his book in 1980, which has never been revised, by the way, and still sells, turning green with envy here. I did one of those dummies books that, those business plans for dummies. And it's done well. It sold 400,000 or 500,000 copies. And as I point out, in America, the dummies market is bottomless. There's lots of things to go. But in that context, Porter, I think he sells more in a week than I've sold in 10, 12 years. But this thing caught on. And as you know, what's his model? We look at how is the industry structured? Because the unit of analysis for Porter and for IO, it's the industry. How's the industry structured? And then he pointed out, well, what do we want to do? Back up a moment. The raison d'etre, the purpose of the firm. What's the purpose of the firm? What's the purpose of a business firm? Profit, make money. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. I know we're at Berkeley, but there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, potential entrants. How do we keep people out? Because if we're in an attractive industry, and there is an iron law, I don't care what you do in business. I don't care what you do. If you're successful, what's going to happen? There's bound to be competition. Oh, no, we have patents. The word China comes to mind. But aside from that, there are going to be people coming in. If you're in attractive, they're going to come in. So what does he talk about first? How do we build BTE, barriers to entry? How do we keep them out? Then substitution effects. How do we keep our customers from migrating away to alternative suppliers? How do we create high switching costs so it's difficult to leave? When you think of these two, up until roughly mid-60s to more or less the year 2000, what was the single most profitable industry in the United States? Which industry do you think? Part of healthcare, pharmaceuticals. By far, it blew away. Number two at that time frame was consumer electronics. It was double the return on investment as that. What was the factor that kept out potential entrants? Patents. Oh yeah, that's right, Genesis 1:1, there shall be patents. This was a made-up concept, but it protected them, it insulated them from competition. Switching costs. In 1981, American Airlines, Robert Crandall, a Wharton MBA, running the firm, came up with the most powerful marketing concept the airline industry has ever seen. What was that, of course? Loyalty programs. What's the whole point of them? Oh, but if I go in the other one, maybe it's cheaper, but I don't get points in my bank for free flights. That proved to be an enormously powerful tool to keep customers loyal. So he talked about those, and then suppliers and buyers. What's the point on suppliers? You don't want them to be able to drive up input cost. And on buyers, you don't want them to be able to drive down the price you charge. Negotiation, how do you get strength vis-a-vis them? Stand back for a moment, put this in perspective. Again, Porter's database was roughly the American economy 1945 to 1975, oligopolization, large dominant firms, how do we make money, no foreign competition to speak of. The Japanese starting to come in, but not much. What's this about? How do we screw the customer? In fact, how do we screw them again? In fact, our turn again. It's about how we make money by controlling the customer, the market. So it's us and no one else. There's nothing wrong with profit, but it's not a customer-centric model. It is a model appropriate to the time when there were not a lot of choices. And so it was a brilliant way to dominate the market, to understand the industry, gain control, lock in the customer, keep competition out, prevent the suppliers from raising input, and keep your buyers, your customers on a short leash. Did extremely well. The problem, it doesn't work today. It doesn't work today. The critics, again, it's static. One of the problems, and this is an issue, Rich, that you learned long ago. Economic analysis is static analysis. Because to make the equation sum to zero, it's static. It's one of the problems that management's had in this. It was click, a snapshot in time. It's not a moving picture. Are the concepts of I/O? And again, if you think of Porter even briefly, industry analysis. Modern technology, in what industry is Google? If you had to define Google by an industry, well, search, information, advertising. The modern firm is all over the map. They're in different ways. You can't do that with Porter. You have to do maybe a dozen different ones. Porter's time was more simplistic, so to speak. You could confine an industry. So the model itself, the theoretic basis from economics doesn't apply as well. It's about content, but it doesn't deal with process. It's the classic economics black box. Inputs and outputs, whatever goes on inside the firm doesn't, we can't deal with that, so we dismiss it. We simply measure inputs and outputs. It's pushing 40 years of age, and I would not have acknowledged the birthday if I were you, Richard, but I'm the same way on this. But it's getting a little long in the tooth, perhaps. And finally, it really doesn't account for the most powerful factor that has changed all of our lives, globalization, foreign competition. Lots of problems with it. So this wall got built. Strategy got better by being by focusing on formulation. Porter, even something as simplistic as SWOT, some of these say, oh, this is formulation. And we essentially cut off the relationship between strategy formulation and how you execute strategy. Because you execute strategy through people. I found it interesting. I found all the comments really interesting, your leadership stuff, Coniston, and what Rajiv was saying about some of the things he was discussing, trust in these others. And he said, that's not a McKinsey thing. That's not macho. That's kind of wimpy, touchy-feely. We don't do that stuff. Strategy became the same way. People began to write articles. There was those funny essays. They got them into really good referee-type journals. But as the academic side of strategy improved itself, the ability to make it work in practice was getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And we get these statistics, 2/3, 3/4 don't work because they're brilliant strategies, but they don't resonate with human behavior. They don't take into consideration people are going to do things. That a sense, again, that Rajiv had, that sense of distress. One of the cases I use, I'm teaching a course in dynamic capabilities, where we're going to, is on Kodak. Many of you know one of these great icons of America, 1880s, George Eastman, one of our America's great entrepreneurs, founds the firm. He actually ripped off a technology from Germany, yes, in chemical imaging, brings it over, blah, blah, blah. 1975, 1981, the future is before them. Sony introduces a product called Mavica, the first digital camera. The writing was on the wall. Where did Mavica come from? It was created, the digital camera, by a Kodak engineer in 1975 who patented it. Why didn't Kodak put this into place? Well, there was something there, that there was a fear. That's human. When they create, oh God, our business model is processing film, chemical imaging, this thing kills it. There was fear. Fear is a very real factor that drives behavior. But the models that think you didn't bring that in, that's not formulation. So structure and process, especially process, began to be given short shrift. Strategy was what it's about, macho stuff. I'm not going to go through all of these, but as I tell my students, and somewhat jokingly, but there's some truth to it, what are we teaching MBAs today? How to manage a steel mill in the year 1900 very efficiently. We're not teaching the knowledge-creating, knowledge-disseminating global firm that is intensely about human behavior. We're not doing that. There's a side story. I'm not going to go into it at length, but business schools maybe, hindsight's always 20/20. Went off the tracks in the 1950s. And we were talking briefly about this. Lee Bach, who was the dean at Stanford from 66 till about 80. He created the modern business school at Carnegie Mellon University. In 1948, they started what's called their GSIA, Graduate Studies Industrial Administration, and he was an economist. He said, none of this case crap. We're real. We're going to do numbers. We are analytical. Management science, that term began to come into the vocabulary. The first textbook ever written on management science, Wes Churchman, who was a Berkeley guy in the 1950s. The Journal of Management Science was started in 1956. All of this stuff, by the way, comes out of the Cold War, DOD funding and whatnot. But a focus then, the age-old question is kind of like leadership. Is management a science or an art? It's a science, damn it, and don't forget it. So we're going to focus on that. And what did you take? You began to take quantitative courses, a lot of math coming in, linear programming, this other stuff. And to be legitimate in an academic field, you need an academic grounding. Well, what do we do? Well, business economics makes sense. And so you had to spend a lot of time in your program learning stuff you will never in your life use in micro and macro, because that grounded real academics, real stuff. And business began to, again, insinuate itself, legitimate itself as a real area of learning. The first Nobel Prize winner in economics from a business school was Herbert Simon, who was at Carnegie Mellon. And one of his many famed comments at the time when when Carnegie Mellon was building up, he says, business schools are the cesspool of academia. They don't have any grounding. There's no model. There's nothing there. Well, they solved it. They did this. So school, again, it began to focus on areas. Retrospect, hindsight, what could it have been, Coniston? Psychology. Who won the Nobel Prize in psychology last year? Oh, whoops, I forgot. There is no Nobel Prize because there's no standard model. You go anywhere in the world today, other than, I think, Cuba and North Korea, and the market model is what you study in economics. Be it in China, in Soviet, what used to be the Soviet, that's the model. That swept the field. That's what it's all about. Psychology doesn't have that. They're different models. So it didn't have a following, so they chose economics. Today, though, and Rich, who is an eminently trained economist, it was like, and I mentioned others, it's like only Nixon could go to China. Only the really rabid anti-communists could go to China. It took the economists to say, we need more leadership training at Berkeley, the soft stuff. If somebody else had done it, oh God, some wimpy stuff. It takes the hard nose. So, but we're beginning to realize those things count, that psychology, behavior, etc. And you go through this, lots of issues out there. The old tools have expired. Let's say they all have copies of this, right, or can get copies, because they're more than happy to.
Oh, that'd be great.
Okay, on that, because I want to go through this fast. Well, given all these problems, how do we deal with it? You look at so many things, recent events. Who is predicting this? Because strategy ultimately is about predicting the future. That's where it's going to be. We'll do this. End of the Cold War, decline of Japan, rise of China, .com, et cetera, et cetera. Who's the greatest philosopher in history? The great Chinese philosopher. Who knew? How do we know who knew that this was going to happen? 30 years ago, when the world was more static, you could predict with a much greater sense of accuracy, but you can't do it today. Because globalization, one thing, and what's the other factor that has changed the world? Globalization and technology, the net. Everybody knows everything today instantly. Very hard to predict the future. But students show up, we got to teach them something, bring out Porter, memorize the stuff, now you're a strategist. It isn't working. We need a better model because the uncertainty of today. An analogy. And are you managing in your firms a bus company or a taxi company? Very simplistic, obviously. How does a bus company work? Well, what's the major asset? Asset specificity. It's this big giant thing that has few alternative uses. All right, you've got this thing. And then management, what do? Well, we apparently do some market research, we create a route. And the driver, relatively speaking, the bus driver, smart or dumb? Dumb. Be at that place on time. The bus gets there exactly on time at 2:50, they're at stop A. Great. There's nobody there though. Go to the next stop, get there on time. There's nobody there. Go to the third stop, there's nobody there. This is last century, build and sell. Here's what I make, here's what I'm optimized to do, come and get it. I don't want it. No, you have to take it, because that's all I can do. My assets have no other use, that's what I do. Now, if you look at that, with all the, again, the caveat, very simplistic. How does a taxi company work? What's the asset? Very different, alternative uses. What's the route of the taxi company? There is no route. The market determines the route. And relatively speaking, the driver, smart or dumb, smarter. On the way, dropping off the fare, where am I going to get the next one? Not a build and sell, but a sense and respond organization. How do I sense where the market's going? How do I optimize myself as the organization to respond quickly? Because the only thing we know in these markets today, tomorrow is going to be different. It's going to change. That we have to optimize ourselves to be adaptive and change rapidly. Because if we don't, we're dead. And who comes back to the center of the equation? The customer. The customer defines everything today. How do you define a customer in your business? Now, somebody give me a quick definition. How do you define a customer? Jens? Very quick.
Well, we only have one, someone who pays me.
Okay, somebody who pays you. Ali?
Someone who uses my
Somebody who uses the product. I'm a little more cynical. What's the customer? Somebody who does not have a better alternative. And if you're not the alternative, you're dead, because your customers today have alternatives. They know what's out there, and through technology, they can source it from wherever, whenever. And if you're not the preferred supplier, you're gone. In that context, then, the current process, is it highly analytical, rational analytics, Or is there some behavioral gut reaction, intuitiveness to it? Business school was all about this. They're all left brain types, Bart. And yet, a lot of things that are happening today, that sort of reaction, that's not how it works. As we all know, and again, we won't go into it, what is the hottest area of economics today? Behavioral economics. And I think it was 2004, the winner of the Nobel Prize in economics was not an economist, Daniel Kahneman. He's a cognitive psychologist. And he said, I'm going to do something different, because if you get a PhD in economics, like Rich did at MIT, well, they call it economics. It was really a PhD in mathematics. It is so rational. And he said, because economists do theory, they do mathematical modeling. He said, I'm going to do experiments, Kahneman, on people. What did he find out? All the basics, the maxims, the concepts of economics don't work. People don't think that way. They are what somebody would call irrational in their behavior. Others would call human. And he said, we have to start looking at that, how people actually behave. That is having a huge impact in economics these days, behavioral economics, and it's beginning to seep into management. Because a lot of what we learned on management, rational behavior, things like that, that's what counts. Rather than looking at, as you pointed out, the solution, but the person is under stress. How do you deal with that? That's behavioral. That's not give me the rational solution, the MBA type. The model that David Teese, and we're near the end, I'm going to just bring this up. David, this very prolific writer, and David really is an interesting guy. He wrote this article, and there are three major components to his model. Sensing, seizing, transforming. How do we sense where markets are going? Okay, we've done that. We've seen opportunities. How do we seize them? What do we do to take advantage of the opportunities that these changes might confer on us? Then finally, how do we optimize ourselves to be able to constantly transform, change? Because the foundation, again, of his model, markets are constantly changing. They're not going to become static. They're not going to become frozen. So you have to optimize yourself to change fast. Time out on this. Teese did his PhD at Penn in economics. Who was his thesis advisor? Oliver Williamson, who was teaching there then. And evolutionary economics, Williamson, who should have won the Nobel Prize 20 years, perhaps 15 years before he got it, but he was an outsider. He was not a mainstream, traditional mathematics modeler. Finally, I think they had to give it to him because his reputation, his work had spawned so much stuff. Teese was his first real student, his first real substantive student. And Teese is very much in that same vein, looking inside the black box, looking inside of managed behavior. So on these, you can read this on your own. But three, and the last point on this. Analytical systems, when we do this. I'm working now on a book with Teese. Teese is inherently academic. He's had a contract from Harvard Business Review Press on trying to popularize this. He hasn't written a word. So, because he writes for academics. And so he knew I was teaching a class, so I got involved. And my first rule, no footnotes, no parentheses, Smith, comma 1975A. We don't do that. We go to what managers can deal with on that. On sensing, how do you know what's going on? How do people sense? A question that I asked, you might remember on Rajiv's thing. How come some people, on the example he had on the LBD, the little black dress, immediately understood that person's in distress? Not everybody does that. The left brain business types, here's a solution. Borrow it, break into the dry cleaners, buy a new one, another. But somebody says, this person's in distress. That is a capability that some people have. How do you sense on that? In the book, I've got this chapter on sensing and the knowledge network. And I'm not going to go into detail. It's going to take way too long. But some people are simply better at it. They were born with that capability. I will take one quick example. When you look at a lot of this, if you think of innovative firms, what firm obviously comes to mind? Is Apple. And when you think of Apple, who do you think of? Steve Jobs. Did any of you read the Isaacson biography? It was really interesting. If you read that, if you ever worked there, worked with him, what kind of guy was he? Yeah, how do I say the word asshole comes to mind? And that's on a good day. He was emotionally retarded. He was an emotionally retarded. How much of that is who he was? Because of learning, a lot of creative people think outside the box. They don't know what the box is. They never evolve. What psychologists, one of the terms you use, but a different one, framing. They frame things. As we, the little kid, you take him to the funeral, the old guy croaked. You don't say that at a funeral. This is a time of solemnity. They haven't yet learned that isn't appropriate. Jobs never learned that. He never emotionally evolved. And maybe one of the insights of one of the things, creative people, a lot of them, they're that way. I have an example. My wife Janet's here, our youngest child, Mariah. I travel way too much, and one day she said, "Oh, Daddy, can we go to the park or something?" "Oh, God, no, I'm going to be gone on the weekend." "Oh, God, Daddy, you're always gone. Why are you always gone?" So I'm doing some fast thinking. "I'm going to work to get you money so I can buy you toys." So she looks at me, and she's 5 years old at the time. She says, "Well, why don't you do what Mom does and go to the ATM?" Now, think about that. Think about that. It's so, because that is the freshness, somebody who hasn't yet framed it. A lot of creative people are emotional retards. You look at a lot of artists, they see the world differently. And how do those people never make it into a firm? They don't get in because of that. So sensing is one part. Seizing, how do you take advantage of the opportunity? Teese is working now on business models and other things. That's part of it. But this also involves behavioral aspects. Why didn't Kodak take advantage? My God, everybody now need a new camera. We could just grow. Oh no, what was the first reaction? Fear. And not time to talk about this, but a lot of evolutionary psychology is so instrumental in this. How we've evolved, what we're fearful of. A lot of what you were talking about, because so much is evolutionary. Men are from Mars, women from Venus, the hunters versus nurturers, etc. Things like that. I point out briefly in Rajiv, there is some interesting literature. You'd be much more familiar. Women make better managers. And something you simply cannot talk about at schools today, and I think it's unfortunate. Women do something men will never do. They give birth to a child. There's a nurturing aspect. You see on the TV, it was meant some heinous crime. Somebody just killed somebody, cut him up, sliced him, fried him. They bring on his mother. Little Johnny's the most wonderful child. He would never do that. No matter what happens, mothers are there. There's an aspect, perhaps, of nurturing. There was an interesting study a couple of years ago. I'm the head of the unit. We're having a meeting. We need innovation. Come up with some ideas. Somebody, you say, God, now that's kind of a dumb idea. Who else? Nobody talks. The business person, judgmental. The woman, I'm generalizing, obviously. That's an interesting idea. Let's think about that. Are there any flaws in that? They approach it. And I think the person who sees the distress is wired differently, Rajiv, than the traditional business manager. The last part, and we'll end on this. How do you transform? Rich Lyons is a transformative manager in many ways. I think you are in many ways. I did my PhD. I'd be a doctoral student today if I didn't get a note from the head of the department saying, if you're not done by June, you're out. I love the happiest days of my life were going into Doe Library at Berkeley. But Ray Miles was there, Chait, Ray Miles, and then Bill Hassler, Laura Tyson, Tom Campbell, and then Rich. Rich has done more in the last 2 years. And this is nothing dissing those others than they did in 20 years. He's transformed. And I think part of it is what you said. This is your school. This is a sense of identity with that. How do you transform the organization? I'm writing the chapter on that. I've written an 80-page draft, but it's hard to do because it comes down to change management. And it comes down to behavioral stuff. How do you get people to change? We could talk more on that because I think, again, Bart, so much of that is psychology. Whenever I visit the UK, unfortunately, Richard, resistance to change correlates with what? Us, age. Whenever I come here, why do I always have the cleanest windscreens, as you would say? Well, I rent a car, and what's the problem? Well, you make me sit on the wrong side. And then what? Well, I come to one of those really dumb things called a roundabout. And I'm tense, I'm on the wrong side, I'm gonna turn, whoop, I've hit the windshield wiper. Why do I do that? Neural pathways, mind muscle. The more you do something, you literally program your brain to do that. I don't even think about it. Why this generalization is harder for old people to change? Because their mind, they've done the same thing over and over and over. It is a chemical process, and to change, Somebody has to literally change the chemistry of their brain. And these breakthroughs we're seeing in neuroscience, they're beginning to have a real effect on management now. But transformation involves that. So ambitions, read that on your own. Not time for Q&A, but is this going to be the new model? End point here, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Porter's analytics, the 5-force models, well, those are all useful. They're necessary, but not necessary and sufficient. And I think Thies is on to something, that this might really become one because it reintegrates behavior with the analytics, just the rationality. It says organizations are human organizations. People count. And to understand how to achieve goals and objectives, we can't just have a brilliantly formulated strategy. We have to put it in the context. How do human beings respond? What are they fearful of? What motivates them? And David is not a psychologist, but I think there's a potential for this. Too much information, too little time, but such is life. Thank you very much.